Well, good morning on this nice spring day in St. John's. I'm a big gardener, so this has been a very frustrating week for me. Thank you, Luke. That was a wonderful presentation. I was going to joke, and Luke mentioned that I'm an adjunct professor, and it's a wonderful job because he never gives me any work, but he spoke to me last night about teaching a course next year. So. And I hope you did all enjoy the film last night. I thought it was wonderful. Big crowd here. So I'm very pleased to chair the first panel of the day and to introduce Frank Gogos and David Mercer. Frank is a member of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment Advisory Council, of which I'm the chair. And I asked him about 7 or 8 months ago to become chair of our museum committee, because we wanted to get our new museum in space given to us by the base down at the Boulevard, new space given to us to set up our museum. And Frank and his committee have done a wonderful job, and we opened that up a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to have it open. We have a student for the summer, so it'll be open most days, and then during the spring, then the rest of the year, then we'll be staffing it with volunteers and doing it by way of appointment. Frank is also a public relations officer for the Newfoundland and Labrador Command of the Royal Canadian Legion. He's an historical consultant, researcher, graphic designer, and photographer. He has a degree in history from Memorial University. He's guided tours to Newfoundland battlefields, France, Belgium, and Gallipoli, and I was very fortunate to go with him on his first trip to Gallipoli a couple of years ago, to visit the battlefields of Gallipoli and to see where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment landed and fought. For the last 4 years, he has led the Trail of the Caribou pilgrimage during the Memorial Day Remembrance Tours, and we'll be going over again in a couple of weeks to do that. He's written extensively on the Royal Newfoundland Regiment's actions during the Great War, and in civilian life, he also works with Morgan MacDonald in the Newfoundland Bronze Foundry. Frank is the author of The Royal Newfoundland Regiment in the Great War, a guide to the battlefields, memorials of France, Belgium, and Gallipoli. Wonderful book, and I highly recommend it to you. He also wrote another book with Morgan called Known Unto God, in honor of Newfoundland's missing during the Great War. David is a library assistant in the map room with Queen Elizabeth II Library, where he provides assistance with geographic information systems, GIS, map production, and map reference. He holds a Master of Science in Geography from Memorial, and most of his career has been spent designing and producing maps with the Departments of Geography here at Memorial and the University of Western Ontario. And David and Frank have been working together extensively, and I know about this, to try to map the battlefield in Gallipoli and to find where Caribou Hill actually is. I'm not sure if we're talking about that at all today or not. Anyway, without further ado, I ask Frank to give his presentation on Beaumont Hamel.
You'll have to forgive me this morning. I'm going to have to read from a script. This is the first time I've given this presentation, but I'll do my best to entertain you. The Royal Newfoundland Regiment has a storied past, but of all the stories, none are as captivating or tragic as their advance during the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916. The regiment first went into active service when they joined the 29th Division in the Barrens of Suvla on the Gallipoli Peninsula, with the exception of a small skirmish over a piece of rocky ground, which is Caribou Hill. The regiment's time in Gallipoli was notable for the flies, thirst, and steady sick parade that reduced the hardy colonials to skeletal-ashen ghosts of their former robust selves. The last of the regiment was evacuated from the Gallipoli Peninsula on January the 9th, 1916. After a brief stop in Mudros, the regiment was back in Egypt, settling down near Port Suez for 2 months in March. The regiment began moving again when the 29th Division was sent to the Western Front. On March the 22nd, the regiment arrived in Marseille in southern France. They reached divisional reserves in early April in the village of Louvencourt. On April the 13th, the regiment moved to the village of Engelbelmer, where they are put to task working on Tipperary Avenue Communication Trench, one of the main access points in the front line. And I'm not sure how this clicker works, but it's in this area here, and it runs towards front line. And if you look closely here, the front line from which they attacked on July 1st is along this strip here. So it was most likely the trench that they entered into on June the 3rd, on the night of June the 30th. On April the 22nd, the Newfoundland Regiment was introduced to a small strip of land that would forever become etched into the consciousness of many Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. It was hoped the Somme battlefront would be a welcome respite from the horrors and deprivations that marked their time in the trenches of Suvla Bay, and for the first 2 months the routine was far more favorable near Beaumont Hamel than their time on the peninsula. The Newfoundland Regiment's first call to action would be a trench raid on enemy trenches in the northern arm of the Y Ravine, a deep natural ravine that hid numerous and cavernous dugouts safely from the constant bombardment of British artillery. During the First World War, in an effort to break the morale of the enemy and to seek information on enemy defenses, both sides developed trench raid tactics. These raids took place mostly under cover of darkness and at predetermined targets. In conjunction with well-timed artillery, up to 50 or more men would be tasked to capture or destroy enemy targets in the trench, such as machine gun placements, capture maps or prisoners that they could take for interrogation. The men were usually hand-picked volunteers, or in some cases voluntold, by officers, and were chosen because they possessed the qualities and expertise needed to accomplish the mission. The raiders received specialized training in close-quarters combat weeks prior to the raid. They studied detailed trench maps, gun placements, and landmarks in preparation for the attack. They also made numerous mock raids in trenches reconstructed from intelligence reports. This allowed them a sense of familiarity of the enemy's trenches without ever setting foot in it. This was necessary as many of these raids took place at night in poorly lit trenches. The men also trained to fight in close-quarters combat with a variety of medieval-looking weapons, some right out of the Dark Ages. A combination of stealth and bravado usually ensured a successful raid. Stealth required the soldiers to move forward through no man's land, cutting wire, avoiding enemy listening posts and working parties, just to get near the parapet of the trench. This was often done in conjunction and with supporting artillery fire that would fan out to box formation to allow the raiders to enter the trench at a predetermined time, as well as provide covering fire to prevent reinforcements moving up from other parts of the trench to the part that was being attacked. Bravado was needed once inside the enemy trench. Often the raiders would break into 3 parties. 2 groups moving left and right of the entry point to clear a section of trench and put up blocks so the central party could do its job and secure the rallying point. Generally, each group were led by a man with a bayonet, followed by a bomber whose job it was to cast grenades around traverses, allowing the bayonet man to finish off any survivors. The rest of the men carried extra grenades and sandbags. The sandbags were used to build blocks to prevent enemy reinforcements to get to the section of trench being raided. The Newfoundland raiding party had 2 blocking sections that consisted of 8 men each, with a well-rehearsed role to play in the raid. The section included 1 bayonet man, 1 bomber, 1 bomb carrier, 1 messenger, 1 lookout man, 1 NCO in charge, and 2 escort men for captured prisoners. Each soldier was equipped with specialized weapons for their individual roles. The bayonet man carried his rifle, a bayonet, 4 bombs, a light ladder, and an electric torch. The bomber carried 12 bombs and no other weapon except for an axe. The bomb carrier was armed with a bludgeon, usually a spiked mace, 24 bombs, and a pair of pliers. The lookout man carried a rifle, a bayonet, 12 bombs, and pliers. The NCO carried a revolver and a bludgeon, and the 2 escorts, revolvers, 12 bombs, and 2 pairs of handcuffs. Several of the men carried weapons that one would not expect to see in modern warfare. Axes and clubs were the staple weapon of many trench raids. It was too cumbersome to swing a large rifle with a bayonet in the tight confines of the trench, so only a few of the men carried them. There were a variety of weapons used during trench raids, which included knives, knuckle dusters, knobberries, which were walking sticks with hard wood or iron knobs on the handle, clubs, hatchets, push knives, and sharpened shovels. Many of these weapons were as crude as they were effective. Few were standard issue, except the knives and shovels, and even then these were modified by the raider, and were often made by the raider himself as a rite of passage. The club or bludgeon was the most fearsome weapon of all and came in a variety of forms. These clubs frequently had barbed wire wrapped around the head with steel spikes sticking out or simply studded with any available scrap metals. The damage that one could inflict on the enemy was frightful. Defenders counteracted this throwback to medieval times by dressing their sentries in chainmail and other medieval-looking armor. Along with the bludgeon, more contemporary weapons like the rifle and bayonet, Mills bombs, and handguns were used. The rifles were sometimes modified to be useful in the confines of the trench. Bayonets were often shortened so the raider could wield the gun effectively in one hand while throwing bombs or bludgeoning the enemy with the other. Early in June 1916, the Newfoundland Regiment was tasked for such a mission in the days prior to the infamous Battle of the Somme. 57 hand-picked men chosen for their strength, ingenuity, bravado, and fearsome demeanor were sent behind the lines for 3 weeks of intensive training. Okay. Just so I'll back up the truck there, I just want to show you the type of armor that the men sentries on duty in the trench would have in the nighttime. It's quite extraordinary that you would see this type of battles going on. So I'll go back. Under the leadership and tutelage of Captain Burt Butler, Second Lieutenant Walter Green, and the aptly named Lieutenant Charlie Strong, their mission was to gather intelligence as to the strength of the German defenses at Beaumont Hamel and possibly bring back a prisoner for interrogation. Point of entry was set in the German forward line in front of the northern arm of the Y Ravine. Artillery was assigned to keep continuous fire on the forward line until the men were in place at 12 a.m. and then spread out to the flanks in box formation to prevent reserves coming up the communication trenches from the dugouts in the Y Ravine, while the main body of the raiding party entered the trench in search of objectives. Using bombs, they were to clear the trench back to the communication lines, seek out a prisoner, capture any useful documents, and create havoc and mayhem for the German defenders. On the night of June 26-27th, the Newfoundland raiding party moved forward under cover of darkness, supported by the 29th Division Artillery, and formed up 150 yards from the German wire in the area of a small clump of trees, with their faces blackened and all identification stripped from their uniform and person, armed to the teeth with revolvers, rifles, bayonets, knobberries, knives, Mills bombs, and carrying two 20-foot-long explosive Bangalore torpedoes, the Newfoundlanders advanced. The first Bangalore torpedo was laid under the German wire and detonated, clearing only about half of the wire needed to get the men through the opening. The second Bangalore torpedo was put in place but failed to explode. The wire cutters were brought forward to cut the rest of the wire. The raiders were discovered in no man's land 30 yards from the enemy's front line by German sentries when flares were sent up. Following a brief firefight, Captain Butler reluctantly ordered the withdrawal of the raiders to their own lines, having lost the element of surprise. Okay. The next night, the Newfoundland raid party was asked to make another attempt, this time without artillery support. However, the plan called for machine gun fire on points 89 and 54 to prevent the Germans from coming out of the trenches to outflank the raiders. A recce by Harold Barrett to secure a passage to the German parapet found 15-meter gap in the wire that ran straight to the German line. Captain Burt Butler, along with Private Jack Lukens and Guide Lieutenant Sebastian Foran, went forward ahead of the rest of the party and reached the German parapet unseen. They took advantage of the gap discovered by Barrett and the inky blackness to reach the German parapet. Foran was sent back to bring the rest of the raiding party up. It had been raining heavily that night, and the men were covered in mud and thoroughly soaked to the bone, as they approached Butler and Lukens on the German parapet. The main body of the raiders were within 20 yards of the German trenches when another flare went up and exposing their positions. A scrap ensued, and the Newfoundlanders inflicted heavy casualties on the crowded German trench with rifle fire and bombs. During the confusion that reigned, several men got caught up in the wire. Others managed to get into the trench. 4 were captured, of whom 2 survived. Wire cutter Private George Phillips of Whitburn was awarded the Military Medal and Russian Order of St. George. Frederick O'Neill was mentioned in dispatches for an exceptional act of bravery when he promptly picked up a German bomb thrown in the midst of his section and attempted to throw it back. Howard Morey recounts, "About this time we made a raid on the German lines to take prisoners and get some information. Those taking part in it had been well fed and drilled for weeks, so they knew just what they had to do. The raid was a success in one way. They killed a lot of men and took the uniforms off them, and thus found out what regiments were facing us. Fred Neal got a military medal for throwing back a live bomb that fell amongst our men. He lost most of his hand, but he saved a lot of our men. Another of our chaps, Phillips by name, jumped down among a whole trench full of Germans. All that our chaps could hear were screeches and groans from the trench. They had to leave him there, but he turned up the next evening, all rags, blood, and wounds. Seems he must have cleared the whole trench and got out and hid in the shell hole the next evening. Captain Butler ordered another withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds, gathering his men near today's danger tree and sending out rescue parties to recover the wounded. Phillips, however, was unable to withdraw and settled into a shell hole where he continued his assault on the line with rifle fire throughout the night. Though they failed to take a prisoner, the raiding party reported that the week-long bombardment of the lines in this sector had little impact on the German preparedness and numbers. By this time, the massive war machine was in full swing on the British side, and in the overconfidence that was the hallmark of the colossal failure on July 1, there was no thought given to abandoning the attack. The attack went ahead as planned, delivering a disheartening blow to the British that still resonates today. The Newfoundlanders suffered heavy casualties as a result of the second raid. Butler and a few of his men, including John Cal, brought in 13 wounded to their own firing lines. Fred Bastow died several months later at Wandsworth Hospital in London. Barrett was also wounded, suffering a severe head wound that would keep him out of action for several months. 4 Newfoundland soldiers were captured according to reports, though the War Diary and Captain Burt Butler cited 3 captured. Peter Barron, John Cowell, and Thomas Coombs were dragged into the trench after the fight ended. Barron and Edward West were tangled in barbed wire in a sap in a German trench when they took a direct hit from a German bomb, killing West and injuring Barron in the back. Barron, Coombs, Cowell, and an unnamed 4th man were taken prisoner. Barron recounted of this time. When the bombing started, a boy named West was hit in the side by a German bomb and was killed. Jack Cowell got 4 bullets in him, and he asked me to try and get him in, but I was hit myself, and then the Germans got us. When the Germans got us down in their dugout, they said it was a good scrap. There were Germans crippled up with their arms and legs bandaged up, so the Germans got a good breaking up as well. Cal died 4 days later at a field lazaret in Velou, France, of gunshot wounds to the lung and back of his neck, and was buried in the Velou German cemetery, and was later moved to Achy-le-Grand Communal Cemetery Extension by the Imperial War Graves Commission. His heroism was mentioned in a dispatch dated January 1917. He took part in a raid on the night of 27-28 June 1916, south of Beaumont Hamel, showed conspicuous gallantry in bringing in a wounded man, and after the raid went out on his own initiative to bring in another wounded man and was never seen again. There were 4 men officially killed that night, including Jack Lukens, who Butler relates in a letter to his sister-in-law. He had a rifle, he was blazing away for all he was worth, and certainly did some damage. During a lull, I noticed that he was not firing. Found that the poor chap was about finished. He was hit through the lower part of the neck. The other 3 killed were Edward Cole, Arthur White, and Edward West. All four commemorated a Newfoundland's memorial to the missing at Beaumont Hamel. But one of these men was actually taken prisoner and lived long enough to be recorded by their German captors. According to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Ashley-Le-Grand Communal Cemetery Extension contains the graves of 2 Newfoundland Regiment soldiers from the trench raid. One is Cal, and the other lies in an unmarked grave. He died a few days after the raid, and a German capture report was unable to record the man's name. With no identifying insignia, the soldiers could only identify themselves verbally. Cal survived long enough to give his full name and rank, and today his remains lie under a marked gravestone. Cole and White were killed in action according to their service files, leaving little doubt as to what happened to them that night, separating Lukens and West as the likely candidates for the missing prisoner of war. It appears West was killed or died in the trench alongside Barron, and not somebody who made it as far as Velu for treatment, approximately 25 kilometers away, and certainly not the wounded man who Cal had returned for. Was Cal shot and captured while trying to get to Lukens? After all, he was returning for a wounded man and was shot while approaching the parapet. Bert Butler, in his letter to Lucan's sister-in-law, never says that he died. He said, "Found that the poor chap was about finished." It is probable that the fourth man captured and subsequently died was Jack Lukens. Having been shot through the neck while lying on the German parapet, he would have been an easy recovery for the Germans and a difficult one for his comrades who were bringing in the wounded. The trench raids that were launched only days before the infamous first day of the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, marked the largest attack that the regiment had been involved in up until that point. A mere 3 days later, the entire Newfoundland Regiment would forever mark its place in the history of the First World War. Many of the men who took part in the raids leading up to the attack on Beaumont Hamel were also a part of the July Drive, and as a consequence, many of them were killed, wounded, or missing. 100 years later, the first Newfoundland advance near Beaumont Hamel still resonates with Newfoundlanders. While the rest of Canada celebrates the birth of a nation, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians mourn their losses in the Great War, and especially those of Beaumont Hamel. Innocence was lost, and hardly a family in the rugged North Atlantic country was untouched by the tragedy of July 1. Of the more than 800 who went over the top, nearly 300 were killed and 400 wounded. Loss is so staggering to Newfoundland that with the centennial upon us, the sting is nearly as severe now as it was then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'll turn it now over to David to talk about the topography of the battlefield.
Can you hear me okay? Microphone is working? Good, good. What I want to speak to you about today is a little bit about the topography of Beaumont Hamel, the battlefield itself, what may or may not have been able to be seen on the day. Within the library where I work, we have this project that we are calling Lasting Remembrance. And it's part of documenting Newfoundland's involvement in the First World War, and beyond that to later conflicts. But at this point, we are focusing on Newfoundland's involvement in the First World War. Our goal is to provide some sort of mechanism and support for other researchers, academics, students who may be interested in pursuing more research into Newfoundland's involvement and supporting their activities rather than really creating a lot of new information ourselves. But in the course of doing so, of course, we are actually providing a little bit more information, creating some new products to help support other researchers. If we look at the battlefield from this relatively modern photograph, this I think is in early 2000s, so I guess we could say it is modern. It's difficult to really get a sense of what the lay of the land actually is. Photographs can be deceiving sometimes. You're looking at it, you don't know if it's downslope or upslope or actually what's going on. So we're hoping that with some of our maps and some of the products that we are creating, that will help give a better understanding of just how things are actually lying. So as part of this, this project, we have created a number of story maps. This one for Beaumont Hamel, we're hoping to actually help tell the story of what happened throughout the different aspects, the bombardment prior to the attack, the trench raids, different points of interest along the route, where the regiment left from, the possible route that they would have taken to actually get to Beaumont Hamel, and the events of the day, including little snippets of video that we've built in. We tell the story as the battle progresses. Who was in the trench, what their target was, and of course, where the Newfoundlanders were located, where they attacked from that morning. What was happening as the battle progressed? And what happened afterward. So within this resource, we have taken, scroll right back to the beginning. We've taken trench maps from the time period, we've digitized them, and we have overlaid them on modern day aerial photography to show what the situation was of the day and how it compares to where we are now. So within this one, we have our trenches, and we can zoom in and out on these to show where things were located. To get a sense of the topography and the elevation, we can also add shading that would give a sense of just how the land lies. So if we were to click on this area here, we know that this is elevation that's between 120 to 140 meters above sea level. Greater than 140. And down we can see over into the German area that they actually were sitting in lower ground than where the Newfoundlanders were. So then, what could be seen? What, if you were in the trench what areas of the battlefield would you have access, or what could you see? So if we click on what was visible, you can see that from the Newfoundlanders position at St. John's Road and Clonmel Avenue, the area that's shown there in yellow is what they could actually see. So they have a little bit of a view up toward what would have been the second line of trenches. They can't see much beyond that. They certainly can't see the front line, and certainly nothing of the battlefield or the German positions. Yes, sir.
Sir, many of us here a minute ago now, you show us where the caribou is in relation to the St. John's Road.
Okay, we zoom in. The caribou monument is here. The danger tree should be here. The St. John's Road trench through here. So the caribou is right here. Does that make sense?
Well, to me it does,
Yes.
but I think it helps people to understand that our chaps came up a ridge,
Yes.
and the caribou was on the high mark or ridge line.
Yes, sir. So I'm going to take a step back from this for a moment and just focus on just those maps. Now, I should point out, yes, if you've been to Beaumont Hamel, you do have a sense of the lay of the land. But myself, I've never been there. And working with these maps and this sort of photography helps me to get a sense of how things are actually laying out. And that's part of what we're hoping to accomplish within the library, is that for the average researcher who may or may not have a chance to go there, then that gives them that additional information to work with. What we are working with to get this area of visibility is we've created within the GIS, the Geographic Information System, a viewshed analysis. So we're working with satellite imagery, satellite information. It's a 25-meter digital elevation model that we have gotten from the French government. So each one of those little squares, if we look over toward point 3, you can see just one of those there by themselves. Right over there. That's a little square that's 25 meters by 25 meters. This one right here. And that's the resolution of that satellite data that we have. So that's why we have that jagged sort of imagery. But this will show what was visible from that point. Within this map, we've also built in this other little tool where we can draw a line from here across the battlefield, and it'll actually calculate a profile. So with this, now you can see the slope, the attacking ground, as they progressed across the battlefield. Now, as I've moved along that profile, you can see just above that, that little blue dot, that'll show where you are right along that line. So from back here, just behind the Newfoundland line, we're at 138 meters above sea level. Across to here, we're up about 140. And then down to the German line, where they're down at 120 meters above sea level.
So it's about 400 meters from St. John's Road phase 2.
Well, along the bottom here, we can see that from just behind the Newfoundland line to the German front line, we've got about 700 meters. From that position back here to the front line, we're about a little over 300, 350 meters across that position here. On this extent of the line over here, from Clonmel Avenue over toward point 89, which would have been on the left-hand side of where the Newfoundlanders would have attacked. That was their target. They were responsible for the section between point 89 and point 60 on the German front line. So from Clonmel Avenue up to the front line, we've got about 500 meters before they cross the further 200 meters to get to the German front line. So that's from the Newfoundland line. From the second line trench, we look at what the visibility would have been. You can see they're getting a little bit more of what they could see. You're getting most of the battlefield at this point, but there are still some areas that would not have been visible to the person in that trench.
That's where the caribou, the second line trench, subject to correction, is where the caribou now stand.
There's the caribou is right there. If we zoom in.
People think it's the front line trench, it wasn't.
Okay, there's the monument with the caribou right there. And just pull back out a wee bit. From the front line trench, you can see now you still have a pretty good view of the battlefield. With the exception of this area right here, which would have been Y Ravine. And you can see that in that area, you don't have visibility. You don't see what's in there. But the rest of the battlefield, you can pretty much see what's happening. Compare that to the German frontline trench. And you can see from that section between point 89 and point 60 that they can see everything on the battlefield. So, normally, as I understand it, I think the high ground would have been an advantage in normal military tactics. But in this case, the high ground actually worked against the Newfoundlanders and the British soldiers that were advancing that morning. Because as they advanced, of course, they were silhouetted against the skyline. The Germans had a perfect view of who was coming at them. So it actually worked against them. When you look at these sorts of maps and these images, maybe it helps to provide a little bit of context for some of the decisions that may have been made that day. What you could see, what you couldn't see, information that was being transmitted back and forth. Was the wire cut? Is it cut? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. We don't know. You can't see. You don't actually have that visibility until you get to the front line and you know whether or not the wire is cut and you have a pathway to the German line. There's a lot of talk too of the flares that were used, the white flare that was meant to signal a success. Well, the Germans were also using that same white flare to indicate that their artillery was falling short. So when you see a white flare, is it a success? You think it is because you don't know what's happening ahead of you. So these are the sorts of maps and tools that we are hoping to provide and make available to researchers to maybe advance their work and help provide a little bit greater context. So within this, you can see there's a lot of information that can be gained. And we hope that, that our work within the library would help to tell the story and provide a little bit more information to Newfoundlanders and anyone that may be interested in what took place on that day. One last thing, if I just have a few more minutes, I'd like to show you. We want to provide access through all these. We are telling the story, of course, through these maps, but we're hoping to actually provide access to other resources that we have within the library. when this comes up. We will be providing links to additional resources that we have. And I'll just skip through this. And try here. Wrong one. Back to chat. There we are. Beaumont Hamel. Okay. We will be providing links where appropriate for some of these resources and pointing researchers to other resources that we have in the library. One is Battlefields of the First World War, a book and CD, DVD, that actually shows photography, panoramic photos that would have been gathered and used for intelligence. This one is Y Ravine from 1915, but looking down toward this way, across into Y Ravine, or just actually just above it. But it'll give you a sense, in addition to the maps and modern day photography, this is from April of 1915. It'll show you the landscape, vegetation, because you often talk of the grass and beating down the grass and knowing who had been across. It shows some entanglements of the barbed wire, not very extensive at this point, and I think these are probably British lines. But with this, in conjunction with some of the maps and other images that we've created, we're hoping that the researchers will get a better idea of the landscape itself. And that's everything that I would like to show you today. So.
Well, thank you, David.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Is any of that presentation on your website?
It will be launched as part of our Lasting Remembrance website that will be coming up very soon. We are working toward a launch date of early July, and it will be available to the public at that point. Right now, it's not available to the public.
Now we're open for questions. We have mics on either side, so just put your hand up and we'll bring a mic up to you. Questions or comments?
Can someone comment whether aerial reconnaissance was useful at that time, or whatever was being used, and how useful it was?
I guess I'll answer
Frank?
that one.
Yep.
Okay. If you notice in my presentation, I showed an aerial photograph. That aerial photograph was taken in mid-June 1916 and is part of our museum collection. I suspect we have a couple of more hand-drawn maps that we actually have in our collection, some items pertaining to the training of the trench raid, and that is one of those items. And it was very useful. If you look at, if I was able to bring it up, you could see where the entry point was for the trench raiders and how that correlates with the maps that David Mercer has been working on. You know, without them, I think it would be a much more difficult task for trench raiders to prepare for such a task.
Would it be used daily, or as a long-range kind of thing? Or
Pardon me?
would it be long-range planning, or using kind of daily? I'm talking with the planes for reconnaissance.
Overall, they were used probably on a daily basis to see if, one of the things that you'd look for from aerial photography is changes in the trenches. If some digging had taken place overnight, and if you noticed in the aerial photograph, all the trenches were lined in white chalk. If you were digging a tunnel or, for example, under Hawthorne Ridge, and you weren't disposing of the material correctly, well, then a reconnaissance flight every day will show that buildup of material and give some indication to intelligence officers what is going on in that sector of the trench.
Right here, in front? Just in front.
Yes, David, I found the storyboard on the left-hand side of the Beaumont Hamel. Found that very interesting. Do you plan to follow that with some of the other battlefield sites like Montgey and Gutencourt and Axmail?
Yes, we are. We are working on these story maps for each one of the major engagements for the Newfoundland Regiment. We will also be creating story maps for the Naval War and other points of interest for Newfoundland's involvement in the First World War.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Jim?
Thank you. Mr. Gogos, you painted an extraordinarily graphic picture, I thought, of the type of hand-to-hand combat that appears to have taken place. I wasn't aware that our forces, or any of the forces, were using those types of weapons, so I was quite struck by that. I'm wondering if these types of weapons were just issued to or used by special forces such as these raiding parties, or how widespread was the use of those weapons by our own forces in the type of combat that they engaged in, not just necessarily at Beaumont Hamel, because they didn't really reach their objective, but in other battles that you're aware of.
Well, I can't really speak towards what the soldiers would have been carrying outside of a trench raid. I can only speak to the artifacts that survive and that come into collections. And trench raid weapons are not as plentiful as the other weapons that you generally associate with the First World War in museum collections. So I would tend to think that the average soldier didn't have these as a rule, but I don't see anything stopping individual soldiers for carrying something like that if they knew they were going to end up in a trench during an attack.
David, would you mind bringing up the map of the visibility from the German lines there?
This one?
Yeah, I was wondering whereabouts would the Newfoundlanders have left from, and where would the German machine gun fire start of where did it all happen? But I could see everything there.
Newfoundlanders were located in this section of the trench here, on Mill Avenue, and what is known as the St. John's Road Trench, right along this section right here. They were responsible for attacking the section of frontline trench between point 89 and point 60. Right along there. The danger tree is located right about here. So, Frank, maybe you may be able to help me out where it's kind of difficult to know, I guess, where the main fire would have come from. I guess it would have been all along the line.
There would have been strong points, and I can't speak to the exact locations of them.
The German maps have all survived. There were machine guns all along the ridge, second line of trenches. And machine guns at a range of what? Several thousand yards. And remember, the Newfoundlanders were alone in that section of the battlefield. So anybody who could see them and had a weapon that could reach them, fired them. Our guys came out of both sides of where the caribou stands, and the caribou, I'm told, looks roughly in the direction of the Venice. Most of those, as we said earlier, didn't make it to the front line.
No,
Absolutely massive.
one of the things that the Germans did do in the lead up to the attack, there was a week-long bombardment by British artillery, very intensive bombardment, but when there was a lull in the shelling, the Germans would come out of their dugouts in the Wire Ravine and assemble their machine guns. And they practiced how quickly they could bring the machine guns into action. And of course, thanks to blowing into Hawthorne Ridge 10 minutes early, they had ample time to prepare for the attack. So we do know that they did have a number of machine guns in the front lines as well, facing them.
And Frank, we should add, the Germans have been there for a year and a half. Nothing to do except prepare for the attack. So we saw the movie, the bunkers were deep. Bombardment did no damage. They knew the attack was coming, just didn't know when.
Wow.
So it's just all, they were sighted in on the...
I think they were very well.
Wiped out.
Yeah.
4 battalions in front of the Flanders.
Yeah.
Right here in front.
I don't need a mic.
You get one anyway.
All right, thanks. Non-academic language, sorry. It's also getting back to the Germans. The Germans had a habit during the First World War, always trying to find the highest point of land, so it was easier to defend. Or in this case, it's not so much where they can find the best visibility, so they can push back any attacks that's coming their ways, and also they're known for their counterattacks afterwards. And in dealing with the machine guns there, I think the tactics were during the war was they would set them up where they would cross-fire each other. It's almost like a wall of lead. It's not like they'd look at, there's so-and-so, shoot at him. It's just, they just kind of do it like a cross, and no one in their right mind will be able to get through that because of that.
Well, if you look at this map here, David, if you can just take that down, you can see exactly what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
If you see, the majority of the attack of the Newfoundlanders were funneling from point 89 and point 6, and you see that's a valley that runs right down into where the Germans in the furthest part of the line. So when you get down there, there's an absolute crossfire just as you cross over the first line. Yeah.
You're talking about the walk in advance. I'm just wondering how the strategy evolved in time beyond the lessons learned at Beaumont Hamel, where they were walking, carrying these significant loads behind a creeping barrage, and how that would have changed in subsequent battles only months later.
In terms of the creeping barrage, that was something that was introduced to the Newfoundlanders after Beaumont Hamel, and it was a very successful tactic at Goudecourt in October 1916. Unfortunately, the Newfoundlanders were moving a bit faster at the Battle of Goudecourt, and some of them were injured and killed by their own fire because of it, but it allowed them to get to the first line of German trenches and take it. As the war moves on, they get away. They use the creeping barrage. They use smoke shells, high explosive shells, and they begin more of a movement in their actions and less entrenchments. And when you get into 1917, you have actions like the Battle of Cambrai, where basically a well-planned, very large trench raid was enable the British to take, miles of ground before the Germans were able to stop them.
My understanding was that weren't heavily laden later on, so they could move more rapidly, but still behind the creeping barrage, but they weren't as heavily laden.
Yeah, I don't think, like if you take in some battles, a lot of the equipment that they carried at Beaumont Hamel were large ladders and pickaxes and stuff like that. Especially C Company, I think, were tasked with extra stores, and it was much more difficult for them to move. And in places like Cambrai, they used tanks to haul all that equipment, so they were able to move quicker and faster. But generally, they would be required to carry, enough food to keep them for several days, depending on what type of action that they were getting involved in.
We have time for perhaps one more question.
Can I add something to that? Because it's worth remembering that the Newfoundlanders' original jumping off point was 8:05, and they were to go from point 03 to point 89 as the third wave. They were equipped with carrying bridges to cross the captured German trenches with all this paraphernalia, huge amounts of it, 60, 70, 80 pounds of stuff on their backs. They carried all that with them when they went up. They were, remember, 4 battalions of British troops had been wiped out on that ground before the Newfoundlanders went out. 3,100 men went forward, 2,200 to become casualties. And the mission was switched from going to occupy the station road, which is that white line over on the right running up to Beaumont Hamel, to attacking the German front line. So, the tactics were unsuited to the changed orders. Anything that could have gone wrong went wrong that morning for the Newfoundlanders. The only thing that did go right was they did what they were told to do, and by damn, they did it well. But, the more you learn about Beaumont Hamel, the important question is not why, not what, it's why. Why in God's name was an order given for those men to go forward in the battlefield that morning? Too much said.
Frank, I wanted to ask you, following on from the point that Ed just made, how much research has been done on the decisions of the Essex officers in preserving their men? Because I think in a lot of the battles where the Essex are beside the regiment, they're cast in a pretty disparaging light for not being as aggressive as the Newfoundlanders. But when you look at the casualty figures, I have a lot of respect for those Essex officers because I think I know what they were up to. Did they write candidly in any of their notes about the decisions they made on the field?
None that I've come across. We do know that they made the decision to go to the front line and not attack from the reserve. And at Beaumont Hamel, that certainly reduced their number of casualties. I don't think in any sense, way, or form, had they attacked with the Newfoundlanders, would their casualties been any less than the Newfoundlanders. There's no doubt about that. It's just a situation on the ground. You're right about the Essex and how the Newfoundland soldiers thought of them, because in several more engagements, the soldiers themselves wrote about how they felt let down by the Essex in Goudecourt, Manchi, and even in Cambrai, where they advanced side by each, while there was first-hand accounts that I've come across where, again, they seemed a little bit confused as to where the Essex was, but perhaps in some cases unfairly.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to clue up now for our coffee break.
John wants to get a question in.
Really interesting discussion.